the benefit of man. All architects are the artists, interlive, creator of the world. Let us show to the world that we are children of the loving Lord. It is the aim of architects of Acya, always to be of service to all people. Now we are here in spirit of the common fate. Long live the comrades of the Asian architects. All architects are the artists, interlive, creator of the world. Let us show to the world that we are children of the loving Lord. It is the aim of architects of Acya, always to be of service to all people. Now we are here in spirit of the common fate. Long live the comfort of the Asian architect.
Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to Acya Web Forum 2020. And today we're going to be having our third session of the webinar. And this webinar is actually brought to you by Acya Committee on Young Architects with the leadership of Chairman Reda. As one of the committee of Acya, this event is meant to booster cross-border collaboration to continue the development of young architects across the region. So Acya stands for Architects Regional Council Asia, and this regional organization has 21 members of national institutions of architectural fraternity. And this organization serve as an extension of each member institute to have regional programs and relations through annual meeting, workshops, exposition, exhibition, and conventions held in different member countries to give a collective direction and representation on matters that affect the architectural profession in our Asian region. So without further ado with that, we are honored today to welcome Architect BISMA from Pakistan as the moderator to get us along with today's session.
Thank you, Kawa. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is BISMA ASKARI from Pakistan. I will be your moderator for today's session for ACYA Web Forum 2020. With the coming about of COVID-19, the outbreak has caused all of us to be in a situation where we are unaware and unsure of what is going to happen in the future. We've all been working from home. The lockdown has been enforced all over the world and has caused us to change the way we live our lives, the way we work, the way we interact with people, the way we engage. Now, during this time, ACYA felt that it is to be more productive, we should bring about some webinar sessions for all of you to make it a little more interactive. Before we proceed with talking about our session today, I would just like to tell you all that if you have any questions, please ask them in the question and answer section, and they will be answered after the presentation. Due to time constraints, we will only be able to ask some questions. So do not be offended if yours is not answered live, but we will answer it via message. Now, for today's session, today we have with us architect ZETH KO. ZETH KO is from Hong Kong. He is the ACYA representative for Hong Kong. His topic today is to become normal. Now, to tell you a little about ZETH. ZETH is a senior architect at Snøhetta and a co-founder of Basic Architecture Studio and Interchange Commons. He specializes in spatial design across multiple disciplines. He is currently the co-chair of the Young Members Committee of the Hong Kong Institute of Architects and the Hong Kong delegate of ACYA. With an upbringing in urban hyperdensity, ZETH has always had high regard for interdisciplinary collaborations and expertise to build an architectural paradigm that caters for all. ZETH loves architecture as he believes that spatial design can inform and reinvent human behaviors and the media in which everyone experiences life. ZETH will be exploring this further in his presentation. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome ZETH. ZETH, can you join us? Hi, ZETH, how are you? Welcome to the webinar.
Hey, thank you. So, shall we start?
Yes, the mic is all yours.
Okay. So, as we discuss normal, I think it's a very interesting topic, yet a very difficult one, because normal has been invented and reinvented every day. And as I said in the introduction video, a lot of things has become normal and is becoming normal, especially in a very challenging landscape where I live in Hong Kong, because in these few years, things have been changing quite a lot. And on top, we have the pandemic. So what does that mean to me or to the city for things to become normal? I'm ZETH, and thanks BISMA for the introduction, and I'm from Hong Kong. So what is normal? I'd like to boil it down to 4 periods so we can have an easier understanding or a more philosophical approach to the idea or concept of normal. So in the following slides, you'll see -50, 0, half, and 1. So these are a number of years. So past normals where we used to live in. So, and which is very common. So you will see slides that are quite, representative of the times. That's 50 years ago. And the current normal, which is 0 year. So we're currently living in it, and somehow we accept that is normal nowadays. And normals to be is 6 months after this. So this is kind of a prediction of where we will be, judging based on where we're living in already. And new normals, things such as sustainability and such. And well, basically it is more of an unpredictable kind, for example, where the pandemic will lead us to. So these are some new normals that you will see. So remember these numbers. So hopefully we can all relate to that. So 5 different categories. I'll start with a bigger scale zoomed out on the city. And then the scale changed to people, so the way of living, culture, and basically activities and program. And then zooming out a bit, how the city respond to people and programs. So the built environment, basically the architecture, and the unbuilt environment, basically in nature, and how buildings and nature kind of relate to each other. Well, they resist each other, or they basically help each other. And workplace, so I think that has more to do with our practice and young architects, how we experience our, well, career, maybe basically how we develop, where do we stand in our career, especially in these high times. So outlook also, so to project a bit to the future, where will we stand, and how do we combat adversities, and how, so what should we look forward to? So we'll start with the city. So 50 years ago, Hong Kong is still quite, so there are a lot of room for development in Hong Kong 50 years ago. And well, 40% of the people live in these public estates. So things are quite standard and simple, because you can see the nice old buses, they're all quite similar. And now it becomes something extraordinary. It's out of the norm. You can even say it's abnormal for a lot of cities, because, you know, all the high rise. But then one thing didn't change. It's the typicality of architecture. So you can see it's quite, you know. So the practice is that to develop a residential tower, you have a typical plan. Basically, you're just stacking it one on top of each other. So you have other things like, well, for the top, you might have duplex. For the bottom, so where the interface between the podium and tower takes place, you have special units, because usually the transfer plates are bigger, the podiums are bigger. You can, so for the lowest flat, you can kind of have a small terrace for yourself. So 50 years ago, as mentioned, was still undergoing quite a lot of development. And now, as the introduction mentioned, we are living in hyper density. So there's almost no room for creativity or really, really different things. So I think in this landscape, it's very important to think about where young architects stand and what they can do, especially with all the regulations pretty watertight. So it's all about quantities. The city is about, you know, following rules, so you don't affect negatively the others. And something not that nice happened 50 years ago. So back in 1967, we have a riot. So it's more about resisting the colonial rule. And then afterwards, Hong Kong become a rather laissez-faire kind of economy. So there's not much government intervention. It's called non-interventionalism. So in a way, for business and capitalist interests, it's kind of nice, because it means, well, less tax. It means the rules in terms of trade and commerce are quite relaxed. And now we are facing something really different. So instead of non-interventionalism, it actually has more to do with how satisfied or how happy people view governance and all that, especially with new laws coming in and with new interpretations of the systems, especially the government systems and politics. It's quite different. So now we have around 1 to 2 million people on the street. That's record high. And it also makes me, myself, or young architects in Hong Kong to rethink what kind of space are we to provide for the people. Is this, do they need more informal gathering space, or do they need more than buildings? Do they need space between buildings and streets? So that would be a kind of more of an architectural intervention approach to view the city itself. So under the pandemic, this is the, well, this is Lan Kwai Fong. So basically it's a street, filled with bars. It's very crowded usually. And now we have minimal amount of people, especially when bars were closed down. So it's a kind of new normal in itself, in the sense that, well, businesses become different. They need to face change. So they need to find new ways to survive. And also the flight industry, there basically with all the travel restrictions, it's quite stagnant in itself now. And with the new national security law promulgated almost in Hong Kong, so the city is an ever challenging landscape for its citizens, for architects, for young architects. So what are we facing as a city? Will we have more of these like on a daily basis? So it becomes the new normal? Or will something settle in so we don't have to do that, or people have the alternative means to deal with that or face that? Will the way of living of these people, with all the political change, with the pandemic, is it gonna affect them or not? Or something violent even becomes the norm in the city? So I'd like to zoom in a bit to talk about the people. 50 years ago, well, in the past, the textile industry in Hong Kong is quite vibrant. I think it has a really important position in terms of the GDP of Hong Kong. And now, of course, the city has been undergoing a lot of change. So a lot of normals in between -50 to 0, actually. So the normal currently is, well, basically people working in offices, commerce, and well, financial sector sort of thrives. But even for them, they cannot escape the fact that we're undergoing a systematic change. So people, these people started to go to the streets to voice what they have to. And some of them even, I think this picture is quite abnormal in itself. So you can see these are tear gas bullets. So in a protest, people start to use tennis rackets to just hit the bullet bag so they don't get tear gassed that seriously. So, well, a lot of things that's out of the norm, indeed, in these 2 years in Hong Kong. And people start to get binarily polarized. So you can see this, I think if you talk to a lot of people in Hong Kong, they would know what this means. So yellow is more pro-democratic and blue is more pro-establishment or pro-government. So you have deep yellow, so people are really into that, and some people even go violent. Or you have deep blue, and people think that using violent means to kind of combat might be even necessary. So you can see there's no middle point here, because usually, as I said, it's polarized and people kind of, regard others as one color or the other. So not a lot of middle grounds, quite a lot of, confrontations, I would say. And the economy also starts to shift a bit. So we even have yellow restaurants. You can see all the posted on it. So these are messages that people want to send to the restaurant or to the city. And some of these yellow restaurants, well, citizens kind of start to, guess that, are they just out for business? So do they want to be on one side, that so they can get more business or not? So there are a lot of suspicions and kind of, yeah, all these happening. So an app was even developed to say, now you go out, so if you're yellow, then you need to go to a restaurant that's yellow. So here is your list. And oh, if this is blue, should I still go? So a lot of these things actually feel polarization of the city in itself. But then, of course, in the catering industry, things start to get slightly different because of social distance separation. Also, they're facing kind of, you know, you need to change your business a bit so you can still survive, that kind of thing. And with the pandemic, masks is one of the other things that becomes very important to the people. So you can see all these people are queuing up for masks in Hong Kong. I think it takes more than an hour with a hope to buy masks, but then somehow you might not be able to get it still. It's quite drastic in a way. But then, of course, as a city that's focused on commerce and finance, a lot of merchants actually have bought a lot of masks over the years, not over the years, but over these past months. So, but then again, because of all the trade situation, price would surge in a way because of all the scarcity and all the principles they regard highly. So for a box of 50 masks, it actually took around $35 US to even buy it at the peak. So things are getting ridiculous in the city. Well, some of these things, because this is a kind of a commodity, whereas other people regard it as a business opportunity. So conflicts are ongoing, and are these conflicts a kind of new normal for the people? Then if we zoom out a bit to say, now we look at how these people live in the city, of course, there's a vessel. So in this sense, it's, of course, we talk about architecture. 50 years ago, this is the tallest building in Hong Kong. It's called Jardine House. It's in Central, and you can see, well, not a lot of high rise in Hong Kong. But then over the years, the idea of high rise to accommodate densities or to react to densities so we can house more people in the city is sort of a prevalent phenomenon. It's so prevalent that we actually have the most number of skyscrapers in Hong Kong. So 350 skyscrapers above the height of 150 meters. So if we define skyscraper differently as that it's 100 meters, there are 1,500 skyscrapers in Hong Kong. But then as I kind of started with the city, these skyscrapers are not necessarily something really special, not something necessarily landmark, but instead it's for housing purposes, developed from really typical things. You can see these what you can say is a more modernist approach to housing, but in another way, you can say basically you are scrapped off of the space or the kind of spatial experience you would have. Indeed, all you have are high rises, one next to each other, more like a clone of each other. So if any one of you happen to have come across the work of Li Siqiao, he mentioned that Hong Kong is a kind of culture with maximal quantity. So efficiency, of course, is very important to a lot of these guys. and you want to shove a lot of things into a really packed space. But then I think since the start of 21st century, people start to question, especially for young architects, they start to question, how should we approach space then if architecture is about space rather than efficiencies? So actually around 80% of these skyscrapers are residential. So usually these are the towers, residential towers we live in. So we kind of looked at the more man-made aspect of architecture, or of the built, unbuilt environment, or the environment we live in, actually. Now, we kind of look at the more natural side. So this is a mountain in Norway. So it's the second, or well, now they say it's the third, but we've been saying it's the second tallest mountain in Norway. It's been there, it's quite untouched. It's called Snøhetta. Snøhetta is actually a mountain. Snø is snow, and hetta is hat, is like a snow hat. So Snøhetta is a place that nobody's from, but anyone can go to. So this anyone is actually us. So yearly we visit Snøhetta as an office worldwide. So of course it's a hike itself, it could be, but then we sort of have a coach or a bus to drive to a certain altitude, and the hike is not that difficult. And in summer you can see the snow is not very serious. So the snow hat becomes smaller and smaller in summer and becomes bigger in winter. So this is a reindeer pavilion. So we happened to visit it. And you can actually view reindeers in the mountain range from here. So it's a quite a cozy place for the CNC, seats, and more fluid kind of interpretation of the mountain being brought indoors. So one of my colleagues actually even brought a sleeping bag there, but it wasn't such a nice experience if you plan to live here for a week, because it can get quite cold at night. And then we have this blatant kind of intervention to nature by the means of architecture. So this is an underwater restaurant called Under. It's also in Norway. So within, you can view the marine ecology inside the restaurant. So it became a restaurant that's quite difficult to reserve. I think the queue is now 2 to 3 years, or if not 1 to 2. But then, of course, I think it's worth a visit. And in these days with the pandemic, I think it's sort of closed. But one of the things about this restaurant is a kind of more textural way to link the nature and material in terms of something that we put inside architecture. So on the right, you can see textile being developed. So sunlight across seawater kind of have a relationship with all the small knitting and weaving. Especially when underwater, you can't really see a lot of colors. So these textures become a very important element to the building. So aside of texture, of course, architecture takes form. So what kind of form can nature inspire us? This is the ITHRA, so it's basically a cultural center for world culture. It's in Saudi Arabia. So I think this borrows the notion of stones. It also has a time element to it. So if we project to the future, what would it be? And I think the exhibitions themselves, it's thematic, so that things that are related more to history well, theoretically, they are put underground, whereas when projected future is more overground. So it's a kind of a gradient of what normal is. And of course, these facade treatments are also seminal, and is a repercussion of stones, so the grains of stones. And the third thing about the built environment is the motif, basically the story of how architecture kind of are invented or reinvented. So as well, in the first part of the presentation, we saw that textile industry is quite important in Hong Kong, and indeed the project that I'm going to show you, the client of the project is itself a textile company. But then, of course, in Hong Kong, you don't just do one business or industry. So it become a real estate developer. So for them, well, for Nanfeng, so that's a client name, textile becomes a very important thing because they're from there. So to them, it's more of a past normal. And actually, this is one of their factories in Kowloon, Hong Kong. It's redeveloped into the mills. So the mills houses a lot of interesting spaces. For example, the atrium. So steel structure are just right next to the old. So they basically slice one piece up and create this atrium. So it's for the public, whereas other parts also include a kind of R&D institute for textiles. So we can have a continuity of these textile industries in Hong Kong. So it doesn't really just stop just because now everyone is focusing on finance. So roof gardens, nice public space. I would recommend you to go there if you have a chance. And of course, conference spaces. So you can start to see all the texture on the window is kept untouched, whereas new structures is added in. I think this is more of a new trend kind of in Hong Kong, maybe even in Singapore, that these old buildings are reinvented or reused into something new. So 3 things, as I mentioned: textile, texture or material, and the form itself, or the repercussion or the kind of mimicry of natural elements becomes this project. So this project that I'm working on is in Kai Tak. So you can start to see all these textile being brought back to, this case is a mock-up of the interior space. And all these, you know, the idea of nature bringing into hyperdensities, I think is something new in Hong Kong. So you can start to see this, that the massing actually has a relationship with nature, and textile as a material. And of course, you can see the kind of weaving in this project. So, or the fluted or curved curtain wall. So it becomes a kind of amalgamation of, you know, modern building technology, especially prevalent in Hong Kong is the curtain wall itself, and its relationship with, number 1, the motif, which is the fabric. Number 2 is the material itself. And number 3, the form. And somehow it's more than that, because, you know, in Hong Kong, usually, as you saw these really tall towers, it's usually a podium tower, a big podium, almost 100% site coverage, and then you put a tall building on top. But this is kind of different because you can see the ground is actually freed up and you have two levels, one on the podium, one on the ground. So we have a kind of more opened up spaces for the public, not just on the ground, not just outside the gated community. This is not gated at all. And also on a podium. And it's not just that these two grounds are freed up. It's also that there are relationships between these two grounds. So on the left, you can see Ithra. On the right, you can see this Kai-Tak project. So instead of a very solid podium tower, it's broken down into different masses. So, and then you put an atrium in the middle. So if you approach from the ground, you can actually go into the mall, which is also a kind of public space because in the lease, basically the public access needs to be allowed. And you go into the crack in between and you can freely go up to the podium. So you actually develop a kind of sense of belonging to not just your space, the space that you live in, because after all, it's quite, as I said, not much spatial experience, but then you can actually venture out to feel that you own some part of the community. This is actually a project in Kai-Tak, which is the old airport of Hong Kong. So it closed it basically moved to the new airport in 1998, and it took around 20 years to develop. So it's under progress, it's under construction. It's gonna be finished next year, late next year. So things haven't really stopped for this project because now you have a lot of intensive beam coordination, and of course with the help of online conference softwares, it's kind of easier. So the construction is still ongoing. So, but it's funny that I think in a week, the contractor has problems finding small aggregates for concrete, but then after 2 days, they got over it, they're okay. But in the other end of the city, the business are not as vibrant or as normal, or not business as usual. Restaurants. So what can we do as young architects to aid or to facilitate basically these businesses so they don't suddenly get out of business? So this proposal I find quite interesting. So they kind of reinvent the program and circulation of a restaurant. So you have dining space, but of course you can't put as many tables now because of all the separations and stuff. So certain parts are redeveloped to accommodate more capacity for takeaway, and basically, people also come to the restaurant and take away themselves, right? So I find this quite interesting, and I think aside of the building scales thing, that is something that we can facilitate. And of course, medical facilities become very important, especially with these isolation wards. So the idea is that the pressure inside the wards are lower. So this is a new isolation ward in Princess Margaret Hospital in Hong Kong. So instead of maintaining a negative pressure here, the way Hong Kong medical facilities are built is that they maintain a positive kind of pressure in the airlock on the left in the entrance. So people that needs to be isolated, or people that, basically if you have a contagious disease, you need to be isolated. But then if you are immunodeficient, you also need to be isolated so you don't get infected. And in this sense, the airlock is an important element to the wards like this, because the positive pressure actually blow out, well, vent out kind of circulation or air into the room. So that's one way of doing it. And I think in terms of how buildings work as separate spaces of rooms, I believe that a lot of us are experts to it, especially our architects with slightly more experience in medical care, well, facilities. So in terms of masks, well, a certain masks production facilities have been developed, or they're undergoing development in Hong Kong. So I find it quite interesting, these three things, that how people can harness or make use of the built environment to do it. But to take it one step further, so when we're all kind of more done with the pandemic, although we don't exactly know when that would be, so how should we inform the new normal so that we can live on planet Earth sustainably? So this is one project I want to introduce to you as well. It's in Norway. It's a powerhouse. It's called Powerhouse, but Acya. Well, to approach sustainability, I think there are many ideas, like the PV panels and all the building components inside. And I think the engineers also have a view on all these. But on top of that, I think to architects, one thing that's especially dear or important to me is how these building components are integrated in architecture itself. Like for these PV panels, I find it quite interesting because usually they're just all sitting on the roof and that's it. Whereas for this, since you have an elevation overlooking it, it becomes kind of that you're embracing all these panels and it's placed together in a nice way. So integration is quite key, I guess. And for this, it's also interesting because usually components are placed quite separately. There's not much of coordination or interface integration to it. Whereas for this, the design itself actually aids sustainable goals. And so there's this low emission concrete in this example, also in this powerhouse. So, and the mask kind of observe and retain heat. So we don't need that much HVAC. And the goal in Snøhetta is that in 20 to 30 years, we would become, every piece of architecture we'll deal with is carbon negative. So this is one of the seminal examples that it becomes kind of carbon negative. So as much as we use up energy for architecture or construction, it sort of feeds back so that in a certain amount of years, it pays off. Not in terms of money, but in terms of energy. Okay, so fourth things, the fourth thing is the workplace. So 50 years ago, or the past normal is that we have drawing boards all the time. This is an architecture school in Hong Kong, and we don't have a lot of AC, so people actually, you can see the guy on the left is in a vest, so it's quite, you can imagine it's quite hot in summer especially. And now we put on more clothes because we have AC, of course, but then we somehow still use the analog way to do architecture, modeling, drawing, line drawings. I think these are still essential to us. So looking to the future, what will we use as a tool? So on the left, 3D modeling tools. So that's my colleague sitting, and another colleague is actually standing. Well, now you have standing tables. So it doesn't really just take care of the work you produce, but these tools also take care of you as a healthy person and a person with well-being, so you can proceed with the creative work or design you're doing. But of course, looking at new normals, these standing tables sometimes break down. So we can imagine that in the very near future, we might all need to sit under these tables to fix them. So talking about tables, the kitchen table is quite important to my office. Not just because they're long or we need to fix it, it's also because it's a space for collaboration and discussion. So these long tables are not just for work, but also, as its name suggests, it's a kitchen table. So in Oslo, most of the people in the office have lunch there. And one weird or awkward thing is that we all sing the birthday song for someone's birthday. So, but then I haven't managed to learn it because it's in Norwegian, and the tone is also different. And aside of that, there's this new normal space. It's quite new to me actually as well. So this is a Monday meeting. We have a regular Monday meeting. So talking about serious stuff, and afterwards, another awkward thing is that one person gets to present a Monday poem. So sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's boring, but I guess it's a nice medium to kind of interact with one another. So you have more imagination, food for thought for the week. And then this is even newer. So on Zoom, we have this hands-in meeting, I think last month. So you get to see all these guys live on TV and from a few offices around the world. So it's a kind of update of what each office is doing, how are they doing under this pandemic, how are they affected? And of course, there are news that's not so nice, there are news that's nice, but I think it's a good way for a certain workplace of a certain size, if they are geographically separated, to use, so that they kind of feel that they belong to a certain place. So talking about the workplace, I think one of the challenges is that when you get out of the workplace, people don't really know what you're doing. So in Hong Kong, usually when you talk about construction, there are two things that people would mention. Number one is the cost. So we're building a new runway in Hong Kong airport, and it costs a fortune. So for this runway, it costs 19 billion US to build. And this is a real controversy in the city to debate whether we need it. And for other things like a train line of 17 kilometers. So this is the current train network and we need a new line. It amounts to around 10 billion US dollars to build. Construction costs really skyrocketed in Hong Kong over these 10 to 20 years. So actually, in this sense, each millimeter of the train line needs around, well, more than 600 US to build. So imagine each mm of the train line. So people start to question, is it worth it? Do we need it? Do we need to still develop so much? And especially, of course, the labor cost and all that in Hong Kong is also rising to a level that, of course, architects would know. But then, well, the layman would just question, why is it so expensive? And this is not it for the train line. So you can see on the right, there are couplers for rebars. So you need to screw it in entirely if you need to maintain a certain kind of thinness of the slab, if you don't lap them together. But then these couplers, they actually don't really, they're not done very nicely. So there are questions. In this line, you have this crazy station where this interface, corner interface between the wall and slab is not done correctly. So it is actually another controversy in Hong Kong. So now that we pay so much, what do we get? I think this is a new normal. Would it be a new normal to me that we need to be ready to accept a kind of higher level of defects and longer level of construction periods in Hong Kong? And for young architects, the route, well, number one is that people might not understand so well. They would question the costs and efficiency. Number two is that they wouldn't understand, well, some of them might not understand it takes a long path in our career to reach certain milestones. So in Hong Kong, as a statistics, 77% of our architects are registered architects are under 30 years old. So we don't really have a lot of really young blood. And it gets really difficult to get qualified as well in Hong Kong with all the exams and stuff that's going on. Well, of course, you all have other stuff in the city like, you know, unrest and of course the pandemic. So in these 10 years or 20 years, the fees and wages are not changed, almost. But then with the inflation factor coming in, we're actually going lower and lower. So if we look to the future, what will it be? How will it be like? So the three things, I think these, well, as young architects, these are quite important and easy to achieve things that we can do with a bit of the creativity. Well, the restaurant, the hospital, maybe the mass production facilities. I think that we can facilitate. But of course, as architects, I think our strongest suit, or one of the strongest suit, should be design. So a part of building components or building related or directly, well, things that are directly related to building, what can we do? This is a building in Taipei. It's called the Eco Arc. It's not, what's interesting about it is not just the mass or massing itself, but also because of the facade treatment. So I think these plastic bottles amounts to around a few millions. So what the insulation and facade enclosure is achieved by these plastic bottles is done by a firm called Miniwiz. I think in terms of sustainability, one important part is recycled materials. So in this case, I think it's a good kind of example for us to start to rethink how recycled materials can be used in architecture, especially for things like this. And shop front design, this is a design that I was doing with a district councillor. And I think a kind of out of the box way to approach architecture is to deconstruct it in a way. So facades, well, shop fronts, I think also this would be quite important for the people living in the city. And of course, interior design might be one way to go if we say that the pandemic is kind of really affecting us, then what can we do? And last but not least, I think this is the most important actually. So remember, we were talking about the public housing estates in Hong Kong, right? 50 years ago. So I was doing this competition with a motif or a starting element from the public housing estates. This is actually a shading device or a brise-soleil in one of these more typical public housing estates. And using this, so this competition entry kind of make a lighting feature out of the motif itself. It's a lighting feature in a cultural center in Hong Kong. So why is it most important? It's not just this project, it's not just this public housing estates in Hong Kong. I think the most important thing is that we still actively participate in competitions, because I think that's something quite unique to professionals, because now that we have more time at home and then we can't really go out and do a lot of things, I would encourage young architects to really do competitions or design at home. I think one of the reasons our office is not that affected by the pandemic is that, well, we actually do quite a lot of design on the design aspect of architecture. So we get to have a kind of flexibility to be somewhere that's not very specific, so we can still do our work. While some other works, of course, just limited geographically. So looking forward, nobody really knows. Do we still need these tennis rackets so we can protect ourselves? Or do we even need hockey sticks? No idea. But of course, there are things that we might not want definitely in our future. Definitely, we don't want to see all these situations. In Australia, for example, we had a serious fire. And we have fires in Hong Kong as well. That's also new to me. Hopefully it will not become a new normal when things go violent, train station or subway station gets burned. And last week's news is that there's a locust attack in India, and hopefully it will not become a kind of new normal. But what will it be? I mean, well, at a time like this, I think I don't have a solid or single answer to the future or to what is the new normal, because as architects, we often challenge the status quo and develop new normals out of that. But I think in terms of means, we've highlighted a few, and it's important, I think, to use the most number of means we can, so we can develop a kind of new normal instead of, but of course you sometimes want to focus on one, but then it seems that in a time like this, with the unrest, with the virus, we can only do what we can. So I'm going to end this presentation with a quote, so hopefully it's some food for thought. There's nothing permanent except change. So I think looking into the future, we should brace ourselves to embrace change or to work with it. So tell me what you guys think, and I'd like to open the floor for discussions.
Thank you, Zeth, for a very thought-provoking presentation on what the new normal will be. If you all have any questions, please post them in the question and answer section, and we will put them forward to Zeth. Till then, Zeth, I have some questions.
Sure.
I wanted to ask you, how has your upbringing in an urban hyperdensity affected your design practice and philosophy?
Okay, let me pull up my answer. No, yeah. No, I think that urban hyperdensity is something, well, it was something new in Hong Kong, or in the environment that I'm brought up with, or in the environment that I'm trained. And I think it's not gonna just stop today. It's gonna be more prevalent around the city when, I guess, the world's population is growing and, well, the cities become older and older. So people, it tends to get more dense, or, well, countries become more urbanized. But with density comes speed. Like, everyone is talking about, okay, we do it in a few days, just get it over with. We have a shortcut, let's do it. I think in a way, when we talk about quantity development or maximal quantity, it kind of has this conflict with design and space itself. And it kind of stops you from thinking what it means. Like, okay, now that we have a clone of buildings, what does that mean? And does that have a cultural reference? Does that have a historical context reference? So I think things, well, are something that we should really think about, or I encourage young architects or myself to think about. Is repetitions healthy, or is it good? Because now, after all, we have to deal with quantities. We can't escape that. And but to look at the economy is, I mean, is quick fix a kind of necessarily bad thing, or when should it be applied? And I think to develop this kind of consciousness on the balance between quality and quantity is quite important in terms of dealing with urban densities. Yeah.
Okay. The next question. Why does the current built environment industry need interdisciplinary collaboration and spatial design now more than ever?
I think it has to do with complexities, a few complexities indeed. When I look at the projects in our office, or the projects that my peers are doing, it's actually getting more complex. I mean, well, in certain places, we're still developing rules and regulations and codes. But for Hong Kong, since it has quite a number of years of history, there are a lot of rules and building codes we have to respect now that we haven't been able to scrap it yet. So complexities comes, I think, in two forms. One is the engineering aspect. For example, fire engineering, for example, the facade engineering aspect, because now that we're doing complex shaped, or especially curtain walls, then there's a lot of rooms that architects would need to collaborate with these more specialized engineers in order to come up with a solution that's architecturally acceptable. And of course, other things like sustainability, we still need specialized or expertise designers or inventors and other things that involve building services. So that's number one. Number two is a complexity in contracts. Now, with the development, with all the technology here, we see things that are new in our contracts between the client and us, actually. So we now see key performance index. We need to fill it in order to earn bonus fees. Like they use new forms of contracts like NEC contracts. And we also have to deal with design and build projects. So we have a more interesting relationship with the contractor. So I think these two things are quite complex in itself, and we can't really just do it ourselves. And of course, well, with that, it doesn't really mean that we should just, give out or dish out some of the responsibilities that should have been us or ours and just do it. But I think it's just like putting yourself in others' shoes. Like, so how we can transposition with them. So if they were to be architects, what do they do? Or we were to be clients that sets briefs and contracts, what should we do? And with popular culture is also another thing, because now a lot of these stakeholders in the community want to participate in the forming or development of architecture, and democracy is one very important thing in Hong Kong as well. So all this, I think we have to collaborate, not just with the engineers, not just with the client, but with the stakeholders out there. And I think it's good for us because our roles in these projects are sometimes quite hidden and they don't know what we're doing. But over time, I think we would be in a more of a important role, not just that would build things, but as a coordinator of all these interests. Yeah.
Okay. Our next question is from architect Arif from Pakistan. And his question is, majority of the population of Hong Kong live in a densely populated residential area or towers. Will impact of COVID-19 bring any design change in the layout of these tiny apartments, especially those with less than 50 square meters, to accommodate self-isolation and others in case of pandemic?
I think that's a very interesting question. Thank you. Actually, so 50 square meters is quite a number, because I think when we look at 2020, around, well, I'll need to check, but then I sort of read statistics about it, and around 3/4 of flats that Hong Kong is building is under 50 square meters. And with the property price, the crazy property price, well, each square meter is more than, I think it averages around 200,000 Hong Kong dollars, which is around 30,000 US. That's completely ridiculous, by the way. So, and the second thing is that in SARS, we kind of learned a lesson with all the anti-siphonage pipe, because indeed in these really dense or tightly knit community or collection of buildings, infection is a very easy thing to do. So back in 2003, actually, it has to do with the bathrooms. So basically, bad air came back to the bathrooms and in the open wells. So the drains are not very well. They're not done very correctly, and with all the missing water traps and stuff. So this urges, indeed, our profession and of course the building service engineering profession to really supervise these works. And I think with this, that's our past lesson. But then looking into the future, especially with all the things that's packed together, and even under pandemic, it doesn't seem that people are really scared of that. Like, new projects are being promoted, and well, for example, there are 100 flats, but there are 1,000 people that want to buy it. It's a very extreme kind of example of scarcity. So I think it's still inevitable. So I don't think that the pandemic will drive or the architecture in Hong Kong to build less dense, but then I think it's these building services components that we really need to refine so that infection would not be a serious issue in the city. And I think we're looking at the refinement of building codes and the practice notes and stuff.
Okay. Our next question is by Tyrone James. The question is with regards to the new normal on previous and ongoing projects, does it affect or still work as the previous design based on traffic and footpath in embracing the new normal? Is there an impact on ongoing and previous projects or no?
Wait, I can't really see the question yet. Sorry, could you repeat it, please?
Yeah, just a second.
Okay.
The question goes as, been discussing regarding new normal on the previous and ongoing projects, does it affect or still work on the previous design based on traffic and footpath in the embracing the new normal?
Okay. Does it affect or still work? Yeah, okay. I think most of them, because, you know, well, the projects that I am involved in, they're quite fixed itself. I mean, of course, we have, well, for the previous and ongoing projects, there are certain ways that, certain really fixed ways, for example, all the codes, the distances, or the retail spaces, or the office planning. I think it's not gonna change in a really short time. But yes, it does encourage the development of what the separation means. Does it mean that now in a certain office of 200 people, we need more square footage? Just because if everyone is physically there, we need to use the whole office? Or does that mean that we can actually shrink these office spaces or workplaces because some of us can work at home? So or does that mean that since now we're paying less rent, then we should subsidize it for housing so people can afford more space to work at home? So I think that is quite, that would be quite an interesting thing to see in the future. But of course, this is more of a leasing or, well, more of a business kind of consideration. But if we talk about design based on traffic or footpath, I think there are two things. So number one is the contrast between the automobile city and the pedestrian city. And it's quite deeply rooted in culture. But in Hong Kong, it's kind of a weird mix. So some part of the city is really pedestrian based and some are just super highways. So I think that might have to merge a bit, or when we look at more pedestrianized parts, well, you see more vibrant kind of urban scenes. So I don't think that the new normal will directly change that, but it would be also interesting to see, for example, how these scales kind of change with the social distancing measures, etc. But I think two things would not change from, well, in architecture. So because program and circulation, they're quite quintessential. And these two things, if you talk about traffic in terms of circulation, I think that's something that we would still like to embrace, even in the new normal. Yeah.
Okay, our next question is from architect Jananta Pereira from Sri Lanka. How are you planning to solve the vertical transportation, especially in very tall buildings, with the required physical distancing?
Interesting. Vertical transportation. So I suppose you mean that we need more lifts and escalators. But now we can only put less people in lifts, right? Because you're not recommended to fill all the capacities. And for tall buildings, it's very important. These lifts are like the lifeline of tall buildings. So one easy answer to that is we can put more lifts into tall buildings. But of course, I suppose that's not the best answer because, you know, it's decreasing the efficiency of transportation. So another thing is that we might need some kind of new lifts or escalators in themselves so that we can still achieve this kind of separation. But hopefully we don't need to go into that if we now are done with the pandemic, but of course no one knows, right? So lifting system is one of the most studied thing in planning these buildings. And it really requires, as I said, collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration with the engineers, because of course we have a kind of rule of thumb within our industry, but then it takes a lot of further calculations in order to achieve that. Yeah.
And what about existing buildings?
Sorry?
And what about in existing buildings? This is the second part of the question.
Existing buildings. I really haven't thought about that, but imagine a building with, say, 50 floors and it's newly built. It's almost quite impossible to change the mode of vertical transportation to something else. But of course, we can do external stuffs like, actually, previously one of my colleagues proposed a kind of external core to these buildings, but it's not a high rise, but we do have walk-up buildings in Hong Kong that doesn't have lifts. So, and it's 5 to 10 stories high, and maybe an external core can solve the problem. But of course, it has to come to that level of urgency if we are to do it, because I mean, again, we're not so sure or certain how this social distancing thing will end. Maybe with technology, we don't need as much distance with help of other preventive measures. So, well, my personal opinion is that hopefully we don't have to get there, because yes, it's gonna completely change the notion of high rise. But of course, it could be a nice thing, but hopefully it's not just because that we need more preventions.
Okay. Next question is from architect Russell from Sri Lanka. New normal should establish social distancing. How do you think that we as architects should ensure social interaction? The way should be dynamic society. Do you feel we as architects are going to establish this effect permanently? Gradually, we are establishing what we don't want in the future. Are architects going to be the catalyst for accelerating people to adapt to the new normal by using planning and design?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Russell. And this again, I find it very intriguing because it makes me think of a project that I was doing, or well, I saw in undergrad. So a lot of my colleagues back then, they actually want to intuitively create communal spaces. So, but then or encourage social interaction. So in LA, since everything is in Las Vegas, USA, since everything is so apart from each other, so people really long for that. Actually, people drive all the time. They don't really see people in a close distance. So that, in that space, we do really need more space for socialization, so to say, or communal spaces. Whereas in Hong Kong, I think the weird phenomenon is that sometimes people tend to want to stay away from one another because, you know, on the train it's packed, in the streets it's packed. And that's why the idea of a private home evolved. And a lot of these guys really enjoy participating in the interior design of their homes because it's private. So I think these two extremes, when they come together, however, still calls for a certain level of social interaction. It's easy to say that, well, it's not exactly, yeah, it's easy to say that now we have online platforms, so we can talk to each other there instead of physically be there. But then I think to qualify that, what can we do? So as architects, it also makes me think of one other thing. Since there are jobs out there which is also called architects, but then it's like a IT kind of role. So should we start to engage in that sense? Or are we just about physical space? I think so between the tangible and intangible, is there a place for us? So I think these are important questions that we might need to further explore down the line.
Okay, last question from Madhura. Shouldn't architects have a hard rethink and a strong reset of the way we think and design? Because we are at the forefront of promoting excessive consumption by the few at the expense of poverty for the many.
So I think this is a question that has a relationship with kind of what we discussed previously. Like, why is collaboration important? It's not just because we receive a brief and we achieve what clients want, I think. It's also about being inclusive, building something that's for most people out there. But of course, these are twofold. Number one, we have to make ends met. Well, we have to make a living, basically. So sometimes we still engage in more commercial kind of projects. But then on the other hand, well, as trained architects, that's actually promoting, well, the betterment of society, let's say, we do have an obligation to engage the community. So when I say interdisciplinary collaboration, it's not just in the building industry, actually, but with all the stakeholders out there, people that we regard as laymen, people in the neighborhood. Well, for example, in Wan Chai in Hong Kong, so there's this building, old building, 100 years old. It's called Mallory Street building. And so the architect actually, and the Urban Renewal Authority actually engage the community to kind of devise what kind of program or what kind of use should this old building be. And the result is quite interesting. They created a kind of comic home base. So it's about comics. But then I think it's the it's also a general trend in Hong Kong that we kind of open up more. So even as you said, the poor people, what do they need? I mean, well, since it's also in a system where wealth is redistributed, if there's a healthy kind of, for example, tax system, then how should we encourage or work with the government so that the poor people get what they need and or even get out of poverty? But I understand that it's not like an easy thing to do at all, especially with government that might not be ideal in certain countries, and there are certain barriers, and they're still quite polarized. Well, the poverty gap is still quite high, but yeah, I think we're responsible as architects, and we shouldn't stop doing that.
Lastly, Zeth, any advice for designers and architects who are reluctant to transform the behaviors or practices without losing their design identity?
I think that since architecture is an industry that's quite, well, historically, well, we have a longer history, and we have certain practices, we have certain standards. Some we regard as normal practice, some we regard as something out of the norm, or even abnormal. So I would say that it's only normal, or it would always be normal that people are reluctant to transform, not just because they are afraid of change. It's also because normal or norms or practices has become practice for a reason, and for good reason. So, but then I would encourage all of us, I mean, including myself, to still respect this kind of practices or behaviors, because after all, we are a profession, and a profession with history. But then I think one of the more important things to me is to understand the spirit of these practices. And in the phase of change, well, the virus, the city, technology, we need to work from the spirit of the current practice so that we can rethink about them, or design them, or integrate them, as we talked about in our discussion. So we actually have a new identity that's constantly being reinvented or constantly evolve from there. Yeah.
Thank you, Zeth, for a very insightful presentation and session on the new normal and how to become normal. We really thank you for being part of this ACYA Web Forum 2020. I'd now like to hand the mic over to Kawa Rizmi, our convener for this forum, and he would be giving his closing remarks. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, BISMA. Thank you, Kawa.
Thank you, BISMA and Zeth. So from the beginning, we knew that this outbreak is an opportunity for us to connect, and we understand that we have to get the point of view of these speakers from different zones. So we are glad to have all three zones represented throughout the series. Again, I'd like to thank Joan, Fawad, and Zeth for your valuable contributions. And collectively, we have managed to get 400, more than 400 participants across 3 series. And we have impart knowledge at par with any physical forum. So this success, of course, is not possible without the hard work of Chairman Reda, Deputy Chair BISMA, and also SEYA Philippine representative Architect Alora. And just before the lockdown, actually we already scheduled to be sharing knowledge together in Stomathon 3.0, hosted by Architect Danny from Indonesia. And even though now the event has been postponed or cancelled, on the hindsight, we think that this pandemic has brought us closer in terms of we communicating a bit more than we usually do with phone call, video call, and messages. And I hope Acya Web Forum will continue in years to come and benefit more young architects in the future. So thank you. I would like to invite Architect Reda to actually close our session and close the forum for this year.
Thank you, Kawa, for inviting me. Well done, guys, for organizing a very good 3 sessions events. And for all the young outside there, I hope that you have benefited from this program. And we will plan something special soon in the near few months, the next month and a few months to go on more topics like technology and other related survival mode for the young architects. So stay tuned. I'll pass it back to Khawarizmi.
Thank you, Architect Reda. Now, I think we open up a poll. We appreciate your feedback and we hope to see you guys again with other events organized by Acya. Thank you so much and see everyone in the future, in the near future.
Thank you, guys.
All right.